No caregiver lasted more than a week in the silent, cavernous expanse of the Vance estate. The problem wasn't the pay, which was astronomical, nor the accommodations, which were fit for royalty. The problem was the ghost who haunted the East Wing, a woman named Eleanor Vance. Once the vibrant matriarch of a billion-dollar tech empire, she was now a whisper in her own home, diagnosed with a sudden and brutal form of dementia that had stolen her voice, her memories, and her light. 7 of the country's top specialists, companions, and nurses had come and gone, defeated by the profound, unsettling emptiness in her vacant blue eyes. They reported a complete lack of response, a soul already departed, leaving only a fragile shell. But then a 19-year-old nursing student named Imani showed up for the 8th interview. She had a quiet strength in her posture and a sadness in her own eyes that seemed to recognize the one haunting the mansion. She didn't promise miracles or cite advanced techniques. She just watched. And in her quiet observation, she saw something everyone else had missed. She would later prove that the simple, gentle act of listening could unlock a secret so dark it would bring a titan of industry to his knees. The moment she finally broke through Eleanor's silence wouldn't be with words, but with a simple melody on a dusty piano, a melody that would make the hardened billionaire son freeze in his tracks and question everything he thought he knew about his mother's tragic decline. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Julian Vance hated the East Wing. He hated the suffocating silence, the scent of lavender and antiseptic that clung to the air like a shroud, and most of all, he hated the sight of his mother. It wasn't her, not really. The woman who sat in the brocade armchair staring out the bulletproof glass at the manicured gardens was a stranger. His mother had been a force of nature, quick-witted, with a laugh that could fill a concert hall and a mind that could dissect a corporate merger as easily as a crossword puzzle. This woman was a hollow vessel, her hands resting limply in her lap, her gaze fixed on a distant point only she could see. The doctors, led by the esteemed Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who had been his father's friend for 30 years, called it rapid-onset dementia, likely triggered by the shock of her husband David's fatal heart attack 6 months prior. A tragedy compounding a tragedy. Julian, a man who built an empire on logic, data, and control, found himself utterly powerless. He could buy anything, influence anyone, bend markets to his will, but he couldn't buy back his mother's mind. He had fired the last caregiver that morning, a crisp, efficient woman with a Ph.D. in geriatric psychology. She had lasted 9 days. Her final report was clinical and bleak. Patient is non-responsive to all stimuli. Cognitive function appears to be negligible. Recommend palliative focus. Palliative. The word was a death sentence for the living. It meant giving up. Julian Vance did not give up. He threw the report in the fire, the slick paper curling into black ash, and told his assistant to find someone else. Anyone. He didn't care about credentials anymore. He just wanted someone who wouldn't look at his mother with that clinical pity, that finality. He wanted someone who wouldn't make the house feel even more like a tomb. That afternoon, Imani Adebayo walked through the towering oak doors. She looked impossibly young, her face framed by neat box braids, her hands clutching the strap of a worn satchel. She wasn't wearing a crisp nurse's uniform, but simple black slacks and a gray sweater that seemed a size too big. She looked like a child playing dress-up in this palace of marble and glass. Julian's first instinct was to dismiss her. His assistant, a perpetually flustered man named Arthur, had clearly scraped the bottom of the barrel. "Mr. Vance," Arthur began, wringing his hands, "this is Imani Adebayo. She's currently on a gap year from her nursing program at City College." Julian's gaze was cold, dismissive. "A student! Arthur, I told you I needed a professional. Imani didn't flinch. She met his gaze directly, her own dark eyes holding a quiet depth that was unnerving. "I've worked in hospice care, sir," she said, her voice soft but clear. "And at the county long-term facility. I understand nonverbal patients." There was something in her tone, a lack of fawning or intimidation, that momentarily broke through Julian's frustration. He was tired of the interviews, tired of the hope that curdled into disappointment, tired of the silence. "The last 7 were professionals. They all failed," he stated flatly. "A test." Imani simply nodded. "Maybe they were trying too hard to find a patient," she said, "and not hard enough to find the person." The answer was unexpected. It was unscientific, sentimental, and completely at odds with the reams of medical data on his desk. But it was the first thing anyone had said that didn't sound like a textbook. "The job is simple," Julian said, his voice clipped. "You are a companion. You will sit with her. You will ensure she is safe. You will not try anything. You will not offer medical advice. You will defer to the nursing staff and Dr. Finch on all matters. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Imani replied. He gestured vaguely toward the east wing. "She's in the solarium." He turned to leave, his shoulders tight with the familiar burden of his grief and frustration. He didn't expect her to last the week. Imani walked down the long, sun-drenched hallway, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished marble. The house was beautiful in the way a museum was beautiful, impersonal, cold, and untouchable. Every surface gleamed. Every flower in every vase was perfectly arranged. It was a house screaming with wealth and whispering with sorrow. She found Eleanor in a large, glass-walled room filled with dormant plants and dusty furniture. A nurse in a starched white uniform was checking a chart in the corner, pointedly ignoring the room's occupant. Eleanor Vance was smaller than Imani had imagined from the society photos Julian kept in his office. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her silk robe immaculate. But her face was a mask of placidity. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were fixed on the garden beyond the glass. Imani didn't approach immediately. She stood in the doorway, observing. She saw the slight tremor in Eleanor's left hand. She saw the way the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air. And she saw the locket. It was a simple gold oval, clutched so tightly in Eleanor's right hand that her knuckles were white. It was the only thing about the woman that wasn't slack and passive. It was an anchor. The nurse finished her notes and approached Imani. "I'm Nurse Jacobs. I handle the medicals. You're the new companion?" she asked, her tone bored. "Imani, yes?" "Right. Well, there's not much to it. Dr. Finch's orders are simple. Keep her calm. No agitation. She has her morning medication at 8 a.m. and a booster in the afternoon if she seems distressed. Not that you can tell." The nurse gestured at Eleanor. "She's gone. Just a body waiting for the brain to give up completely." Imani's jaw tightened. She remembered hearing those exact words from a doctor about her little brother Noah in the days before he died. "He's gone. We're just managing the decline." They had been wrong. Noah had been there, trapped, and she hadn't known how to reach him. The memory was a fresh, sharp pain. She looked back at Eleanor, at the hand clutching the locket. Later that day, after the nurse had left, Dr. Finch himself paid a visit. He was a handsome man in his late 60s, with a warm smile and a reassuring bedside manner that felt practiced, perfected. He greeted Imani with polite condescension. "Ah, the new girl. Welcome. Just keep things quiet, my dear. The less stimulation, the better for Eleanor." He walked over to his patient, patting her hand gently. "How are we today, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice syrupy sweet. He didn't wait for an answer. As he spoke, Imani watched Eleanor's hand. As his fingers brushed against hers, the hand holding the locket tightened, the knuckles turning bone white. Her breathing hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible gasp. Her vacant eyes, for a split second, seemed to focus, to sharpen with a glint of something that looked like steel, or fear. It was there and then it was gone, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Dr. Finch didn't notice. He was already talking to Julian, who had just entered the room, about adjusting the dosage of her primary medication. But Imani saw it. It was the first crack in the facade of emptiness. It was the first clue that the ghost in the East Wing was not a ghost at all. She was a prisoner. The first week was a study in silence and routine. Imani learned the rhythms of the house, the quiet footsteps of the cleaning staff, the hushed, reverent tones everyone used when speaking of the situation. She learned the schedule of Nurse Jacobs, who arrived precisely at 7:55 a.m., administered a small cup of pills and water to a passive Eleanor, and departed after charting the non-events of the day. Julian remained a distant, brooding presence, a ghost of a different sort, haunting his home office, the phone perpetually attached to his ear as he commanded his global empire. He rarely visited the East Wing. It was clear the sight of his mother's decline was a pain he couldn't tolerate. Imani's role was, as he'd commanded, to simply be present. She would sit in a chair a few feet from Eleanor, sometimes reading a book, sometimes just watching the light change in the solarium. But she wasn't just sitting. She was observing. Her mind, sharpened by the grief of her own loss, was a finely tuned instrument for detecting the subtle signals of the trapped and the silent. She started a small, secret log in a worn notebook she kept in her satchel. 8:05 a.m. Medication administered. 9:00 a.m. Subject exhibits deep lethargy, almost catatonic. Breathing shallow, eyes unfocused. 11:00 a.m. Lethargy persists. No response to external sounds, door closing, phone ringing in hallway. 2:00 p.m. Nurse Jacobs administers afternoon booster. The pattern was undeniable. For about an hour before the morning medication, Eleanor seemed different. It was subtle, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. A slight alertness in her posture, the way her eyes would track a bird flitting past the window. The tremor in her hand would lessen. But after the pills, the fog would roll in, thick and absolute, erasing whatever flicker of presence had been there. Imani began to suspect the cure was the disease. The medicine meant to calm her agitation was, in fact, inducing the very state everyone mistook for dementia. Her first experiment was simple. The solarium, where they spent most of their days, was a sad, neglected space. The glass was grimy, the exotic plants brown and withered in their pots. It smelled of dust and decay. It was a room that had given up, just like its primary resident. One afternoon, while Eleanor sat in her usual chair, Imani found a watering can and a cloth. She began, quietly, to clean. She wiped down the glass panes, letting in slivers of brighter, clearer light. She watered a parched fern, its fronds uncurling slightly, as if in gratitude. She worked for an hour, the only sounds the slosh of water and the squeak of the cloth on glass. She didn't speak to Eleanor or try to engage her. She simply changed the environment. After a while, she glanced over. Eleanor's head had turned, just a fraction of an inch, toward the fern Imani had just watered. Her gaze, usually fixed on the middle distance, was on the plant. Her fingers, which perpetually clutched the gold locket, had relaxed ever so slightly. It was a tiny shift, but it was a signal. The change in the room had registered. Emboldened, Imani escalated her efforts. She knew from a brief conversation with a long-serving cook that Eleanor had loved music, particularly the Romantic composers, Chopin, Liszt. The grand piano in the main drawing room was always closed, a silent, monolithic tomb. But in the corner of the solarium, under a dusty sheet, was a smaller, older upright piano. Julian had probably forgotten it was even there. The next day, Imani brought her phone into the solarium. She found a recording of Chopin's Nocturnes and played it softly. At first, there was no reaction, the same placid emptiness. Imani felt a familiar pang of disappointment, but she let the music play. Halfway through the second piece, she saw it. A single tear escaped from the corner of Eleanor's right eye and traced a silent path down her powdered cheek. Her breathing pattern changed, deepening slightly. Her thumb began to move, rubbing back and forth, over the smooth, cool surface of her locket. Imani logged it in her notebook, her heart pounding. 3:15 p.m. Played Chopin. Subject produced a tear. Increased tactile interaction with locket. The locket. It was always the locket. It was her totem, her connection to whatever world she was locked inside. Imani knew that if she was ever going to truly reach Eleanor, she had to understand the significance of that small piece of gold. The next day she sat closer to Eleanor than usual. "That's a beautiful locket, Mrs. Vance," Imani said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She expected no response. She was just planting a seed, speaking to the person she believed was still there. "It looks like it's very special to you." For a long moment there was nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then Eleanor's fingers tightened around the locket, and she lifted her hand, a motion so slow and deliberate it seemed to take a colossal effort. She didn't open her hand, but she moved it an inch toward Imani. It wasn't an offering, not yet. It was an acknowledgement, an invitation. Imani felt a tremor of excitement, quickly suppressed. She had to be patient. That evening, as she was tidying the solarium, she ran her fingers over the keys of the dusty piano. Most were stuck, but a few in the middle octave produced a tinny, melancholic sound. She remembered the cook mentioning something else. Mr. Vance, the old Mr. Vance. David. He wasn't just a businessman. He used to write music for her. Little things. Her own private songs. An idea began to form in Imani's mind, a risky, audacious idea. It went directly against Julian's orders. It could get her fired instantly. But it felt like the only path forward. The next morning she arrived early, before Nurse Jacobs. She found Eleanor already awake, the pre-medication clarity in her eyes more pronounced than ever. Imani knelt before her. "Eleanor," she said, using her first name for the first time. The use of her name caused a flicker in the woman's eyes. "I think you're in there, and I think you're scared. I want to help you." She didn't know where the words came from, but they felt true. She was no longer just a caregiver. She was an ally. The real test would be the piano. Imani knew she had to find the music. The cook's words about David Vance's compositions echoed in her mind. If music was a key, then his music would be the master key. She spent her brief breaks and the quiet moments when Eleanor was in her deepest medicated slumber, searching not for evidence of a crime, but for evidence of a life. She started in the solarium. The dusty piano was her beacon. The piano bench was locked, the small brass keyhole tarnished with age. It felt significant, a locked bench in a forgotten room. It was a secret waiting to be told. After 2 days of gentle probing with a paperclip, a skill she'd learned out of boredom during a particularly long shift at the county facility, the lock gave way with a soft, metallic click. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed, crumbling sheet music from a bygone era, was a single, leather-bound folio. It was newer than the rest. The gold-leaf title on the cover was simple. For E. Imani lifted it out, her hands trembling slightly. The pages were filled not with printed notes, but with elegant, handwritten calligraphy. They were melodies, simple and intimate, with titles like Solarium Sunrise and Whispers in the Garden. This was it. This was David's music for Eleanor. She felt like an archaeologist unearthing a sacred text. This was more than music. It was a conversation, a love story told in notes and chords. She knew what she had to do, and the risk no longer mattered. The potential reward, a flicker of recognition, a single sign of life, was worth more than any job. The next afternoon, she waited for the window. She had timed it perfectly. Nurse Jacobs was gone for the day. Julian was in a video conference marathon, his voice a distant, authoritative murmur from the West Wing. The house was still. She helped Eleanor into her usual chair in the now-clean solarium, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the floor. Imani sat at the old upright piano, the leather folio open before her. Her own piano skills were rudimentary, learned from a patient teacher in a community center years ago, long since lapsed. Her fingers felt clumsy and stiff. She chose the simplest piece, a lullaby titled Eleanor's Dream. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the yellowed ivory keys, and began to play. The notes were hesitant at first, stumbling over one another. The piano was horribly out of tune, the sound tinny and melancholic. It was a pale imitation of what the composer must have intended. She faltered, thinking it was a foolish idea. She glanced back at Eleanor, expecting to see the same vacant stare. But something was different. Eleanor's head, usually slumped slightly to one side, was now erect. Her body was leaning forward, a subtle shift, but a monumental one. Her pale blue eyes were fixed on Imani's hands. There was a fierce, desperate attention in her gaze. Imani's breath caught in her throat. She continued to play, her fingers gaining a small measure of confidence from the reaction. The simple melody filled the quiet room, a ghost of a song from a happier time. Then it happened. A sound, small and fragile, broke the silence. It was a hitching, ragged gasp, followed by a soft, guttural noise. A single word, fractured and coated in the dust of long disuse. "Da-vid." The word was barely audible, a ghost of a whisper, but it was clear. Imani's hands froze on the keys. She turned slowly to face Eleanor. The mask of placidity was gone. Eleanor's face was alive with a storm of emotion. Her brows were furrowed in concentration, her lips parted as if to speak again. And her eyes were no longer vacant. They were sharp, intelligent, and swimming with unshed tears. A single tear escaped and tracked a path down her wrinkled cheek, the second tear Imani had ever seen her shed. Eleanor lifted her left hand, the one that always trembled, and reached out, her fingers twitching, mimicking the motion of playing the keys. She was connecting the music to the man. She was remembering. "Eleanor?" Imani whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. Eleanor's eyes met hers, and in that moment there was no patient and no caregiver. There was only a profound, silent communication. A plea. A thank you. A confirmation. And then, as if the effort was too much, Eleanor's face slackened. The light in her eyes dimmed, though it didn't extinguish completely. She slumped back in her chair, her hand falling to her lap, her breathing deep and even. She was asleep. But it wasn't the heavy, unnatural slumber induced by the medication. It was the peaceful sleep of exhaustio.